Imagine two of America's closest allies in the Middle East, countries that stood shoulder to shoulder through wars and blockades, suddenly turning their weapons on each other, not in some distant future scenario, but right now, in December 2025, when Saudi warplanes bombed a weapons shipment in Yemen. The twist that left Washington speechless? Those weren't Iranian weapons. They weren't destined for terrorists. They were Emirati arms headed to UAE-backed forces, and Saudi Arabia just declared war on its former partner's proxy army. Behind the polite smiles at diplomatic summits and the carefully worded joint statements lies the most consequential power struggle in the modern Middle East. A rivalry so intense that it's reshaping alliances from Sudan to Syria, forcing countries to choose sides, and creating a geopolitical chessboard where America's two strongest Gulf partners are playing against each other while both claim to be Washington's best friend. For most of the 2010s, if you understood Middle Eastern politics, you understood that Saudi Arabia and the UAE moved as one. They were the dynamic duo of Gulf geopolitics, coordinating on everything that mattered and presenting a unified front to the world. When the Arab Spring threatened monarchies across the region, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi deployed joint forces to Bahrain to crush protests that could have spread instability. When Qatar needed to be taught a lesson about supporting Islamist movements, Saudi Arabia and the UAE led a comprehensive blockade, starting in 2017, that isolated Doha diplomatically and economically. In Egypt, both countries worked together to consolidate the rule of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi after the military coup against the Muslim Brotherhood, pouring billions into Cairo to ensure a friendly government. In Yemen, they formed a military coalition to fight Houthi rebels, with Saudi forces operating in the north while UAE troops secured the south. Libya, Syria, counterterrorism efforts across the region, even their approach toward Iran and Turkey before 2019, showed remarkable alignment between these two Gulf powerhouses. The relationship wasn't just political convenience. It was deeply personal, rooted in the bond between two leaders who seemed destined to reshape the Middle East together. Mohammed bin Zayed, known as MBZ, the 64-year-old president of the UAE and de facto ruler for years before that, played mentor to the much younger Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, who was just emerging as a force in Saudi politics. When MBS was maneuvering to become crown prince, displacing older rivals in a palace coup that disturbed traditional Saudi succession by seniority, MBZ actively supported his rise. He lobbied Western governments on MBS's behalf, encouraged Saudi elites to back the young prince, and used his considerable diplomatic influence to smooth MBS's path to power. At just 29 years old, MBS became Saudi defense minister in 2015, then deputy crown prince, and finally crown prince in 2017, consolidating power at unprecedented speed for someone so young. For the UAE, helping elevate MBS wasn't charity. It was strategic investment in gaining influence over the much larger and wealthier Saudi state. And for several years, that investment paid enormous dividends. The two leaders developed a close working relationship that translated into coordinated regional strategy. When they launched the Yemen intervention in 2015, it represented the most significant military operation by Arab states in modern history, a massive coalition effort that was supposed to quickly restore the internationally recognized government and push back Iranian influence. The partnership looked unshakable, two visionary young leaders, MBZ with his experience and MBS with his ambition and resources, working together to remake a region that had been defined by chaos and dysfunction since the Arab Spring. Western capitals love the narrative of reformist Gulf leaders partnering to bring stability, investment, and modernity to the Middle East. But beneath the surface of that partnership, fundamental tensions were building that would eventually tear the relationship apart. The first cracks appeared in Yemen itself, where diverging priorities became impossible to ignore. Saudi Arabia needed Yemen's unity and stable central control. Riyadh's strategic nightmare is a fragmented Yemen where Iranian-backed Houthis control the north near Saudi's southern border while chaos reigns elsewhere, creating permanent instability on the kingdom's vulnerable frontier. The Saudi approach focused on defeating the Houthis and restoring a unified government loyal to Riyadh that could provide strategic depth and prevent threats from emerging. The UAE had completely different objectives. Abu Dhabi wasn't particularly concerned about Yemeni unity or central government control. What the UAE wanted was control over strategic ports in southern Yemen, particularly Aden and Mukalla, that could serve Emirati commercial and military interests. They also wanted to crush Muslim Brotherhood influence wherever it appeared, viewing Islamist political movements as existential threats to monarchical stability. So the UAE cultivated deep ties with the Southern Transitional Council, a separatist organization formed in 2017 that seeks autonomy or outright independence for southern Yemen. The STC wasn't interested in restoring Yemen's central government. They wanted to break away. The UAE provided money, weapons, training, and political support to make that happen. For years, Saudi Arabia tolerated this divergence because the coalition was still technically fighting together against the Houthis. But tolerance has limits, and those limits were crossed in dramatic fashion. In December 2025, when STC forces, emboldened by Emirati backing, seized control of Hadramaut and Mahra provinces in southern Yemen. These weren't just random territories. Hadramaut is resource-rich with significant oil and gas reserves. Mahra borders Oman and Saudi Arabia, giving whoever controls it strategic leverage over regional trade routes and access to the Arabian Sea. For Saudi Arabia, watching Emirati-backed forces take over provinces on its southern border crossed every conceivable red line. The Saudi response was swift and unprecedented. On December 29th, Saudi warplanes bombed what Riyadh described as Emirati weapons shipments at the port of Mukalla, destroying arms and equipment destined for STC separatists. This wasn't a mistake or accident. This was a deliberate military strike against an ally's proxy forces, the kind of action you take against enemies, not partners. Saudi Arabia followed up with a public ultimatum demanding complete UAE withdrawal from Yemen and an end to all support for local armed actors, unmistakable reference to the Southern Transitional Council. The language was harsh, describing UAE actions as highly dangerous behavior that threatened Saudi national security. For two Gulf states that pride themselves on diplomatic restraint and carefully managed public images, this was the equivalent of declaring open hostility. Even during the worst tensions of the Qatar blockade, Saudi Arabia never directly bombed forces aligned with another Gulf state. This was new territory, and it signaled that the gloves were off. The UAE's initial response appeared conciliatory on the surface. Abu Dhabi announced withdrawal of approximately 200 troops and equipment from Yemen, a move widely interpreted as avoiding direct military confrontation with the much larger Saudi armed forces. But withdrawals don't tell the whole story. The UAE has spent years building relationships with Yemeni commanders, training local forces, and establishing networks of influence that don't require permanent troop presence to maintain. By January 4th, 2026, STC forces were forced to withdraw from Hadramaut and Mahra under Saudi pressure, and the council agreed to talks proposed by Riyadh. On the surface, it looked like Saudi Arabia had won this round. In reality, the confrontation exposed how fundamentally incompatible Saudi and Emirati objectives had become, and Yemen was just one theater in a much larger strategic competition. The rivalry extends into Sudan, where the pattern repeats with even higher stakes. Since April 2023, Sudan has been torn apart by civil war between the regular Sudanese armed forces, led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, a powerful militia with roots in the Janjaweed groups responsible for atrocities in Darfur. The UAE has been widely accused by multiple intelligence agencies and UN investigators of providing sophisticated weapons, ammunition, and logistical support to the RSF through smuggling networks that run through Libya, Chad, and the Central African Republic. Abu Dhabi consistently denies these accusations, but the evidence from flight tracking data, satellite imagery of cargo shipments, and battlefield weapons analysis has convinced most observers that Emirati support for the RSF is real and substantial. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, backs the Sudanese armed forces and has positioned itself alongside the United States as a supporter of mediation efforts to end the conflict. In November 2025, when MBS traveled to Washington to meet President Trump, Sudan was high on his agenda. Multiple Arab and Western officials told reporters that the Saudi Crown Prince planned to lobby Trump specifically about UAE's role in prolonging the Sudan war through RSF support. This represented rare direct engagement by MBS on Sudan, a conflict that had previously taken back seat to other regional issues. The message was clear. Saudi Arabia wanted American pressure on the UAE to stop arming the RSF. In the weeks following that Washington meeting, Riyadh dramatically stepped up material support to the Sudanese armed forces, reportedly allocating $3 billion and even offering to purchase all of Sudan's gold production, effectively underwriting the SAF financially and marginalizing other actors. This wasn't subtle diplomacy. This was Saudi Arabia throwing resources at a problem to counter Emirati influence and demonstrate that when it comes to regional power projection, Riyadh's checkbook is bigger. Then there's Somalia and Somaliland, where the rivalry takes on additional complexity involving Israel. In late December 2025, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu shocked the region by officially recognizing Somaliland's independence from Somalia, the first major state to do so. The move was widely understood to be linked to Somaliland authorizing Israeli military presence, or at minimum intelligence gathering facilities, aimed at monitoring Houthi activity in Yemen across the Gulf of Aden. This recognition triggered immediate condemnation from scores of countries, including almost every Muslim and Arab state. Saudi Arabia joined that condemnation vocally, opposing fragmentation of Somali territory. The UAE's name was conspicuously absent from the list of countries opposing Netanyahu's decision. That absence speaks volumes because Abu Dhabi has deep investments in Somaliland, managing most of its major ports, including Berbera, a key commercial hub, and serving as primary destination for Somaliland's exports, while playing central roles in developing commercial and security infrastructure. The UAE's silence on Israeli recognition of Somaliland revealed where Abu Dhabi's priorities lie. And it's not with preserving established borders or Arab League consensus. This pattern of the UAE supporting separatist movements, paramilitary forces, and territorial fragmentation, while Saudi Arabia backs central governments and established borders, has become the defining characteristic of their rivalry. Analysts describe it as two fundamentally different visions for how the region should be organized. Saudi Arabia's approach is conservative in the literal sense, seeking to preserve state structures, support recognized governments, and prevent the kind of chaos that creates space for Iranian influence or extremist groups. The UAE's approach is more aggressive and unconventional, cultivating relationships with non-state actors who can advance Emirati interests regardless of whether that undermines central authority. In Syria, this divergence appears again. Saudi Arabia has shown willingness to work with interim President Ahmad al-Sharaa, a figure with historical jihadist associations who fought with al-Qaeda affiliates, because he has demonstrated pragmatic governance and ideological retreat from overt religious framing. The UAE remains deeply suspicious of anyone with Islamist background and possibly invests in counterforces to hedge against outcomes Riyadh accepts. The ideological dimension matters here in ways that complicate the relationship beyond simple power competition. The UAE has adopted an absolutist stance against political Islam in any form, viewing Muslim Brotherhood movements and anyone associated with Islamist politics as permanent enemies requiring elimination. This isn't pragmatic assessment of specific groups. This is ideological commitment that shapes Emirati foreign policy across multiple theaters from Libya to Sudan to Syria. Saudi Arabia shares aversion to political Islam, but adopts far more pragmatic stance, differentiating between Islamist groups, assessing their strategic utility, and evaluating willingness to compromise. Riyadh's policy is transactional rather than purely ideological, prioritizing state stability and regional influence. When Saudi Arabia recently normalized relations with Qatar and embraced closer ties with Turkey, both countries, the UAE, spent years trying to isolate for their Islamist connections. It reflected fundamentally different strategic calculations. MBS is willing to work with Qatar's Emir and Turkey's Erdogan if it advances Saudi interests. MBZ sees such partnerships as betrayals of core principles. But ideology alone doesn't explain the intensity of this rivalry. Economics drives as much tension as geopolitics, and here, the competition has become genuinely zero-sum in ways that threaten both countries' long-term development plans. For decades, the UAE was the unquestioned economic powerhouse of the Gulf, building Dubai into a global hub for finance, logistics, tourism, and business that attracted talent and capital from across the world. The emirate capitalized on business-friendly regulations, deep liquidity, world-class infrastructure, and a cosmopolitan environment that made Western executives actually want to live there. Abu Dhabi anchored energy production and sovereign wealth, while Dubai dominated services. By 2023, the UAE attracted $30 billion in foreign direct investment, up from $22 billion the previous year, making it the second largest FDI destination in the developing world. Dubai International Financial Center reported 7,700 active companies by mid-2025. The city's ports, particularly Jebel Ali, handled 14.5 million 20-foot equivalent units in 2023. This was the model everyone else aspired to replicate. Then came Saudi Vision 2030, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's breathtakingly ambitious plan to transform the kingdom's economy, society, and global position by the end of this decade. Launched in 2016, Vision 2030 aims to diversify Saudi Arabia away from oil dependence, develop tourism, entertainment, and technology sectors, and position Riyadh as a regional hub rivaling or surpassing Dubai. The scale is almost incomprehensible. Massive projects like Eniom, a $500 billion futuristic city being built from scratch in the desert, the Red Sea project creating luxury tourism destinations, the King Abdullah Financial District in Riyadh, designed to compete directly with Dubai's financial center. But Vision 2030 isn't just about building impressive structures. It's about fundamentally redistributing where economic activity happens in the Gulf, and that means challenging UAE dominance directly. Saudi Arabia has pursued this challenge through both carrots and sticks that make Emirati officials deeply uncomfortable. The biggest stick is a policy requiring international companies that want to do business with the Saudi government to establish regional headquarters in Riyadh, Dammam, or Jeddah by 2024. Not Dubai, not Abu Dhabi, Saudi cities. The implicit message is brutal. If you want access to Saudi contracts and the largest economy in the Middle East, you relocate. The goal is convincing at least 480 major global companies with annual revenues exceeding $1 billion to set up Saudi headquarters by 2030. The policy has worked partially. Apple, Google, Microsoft, Siemens, and PepsiCo have all established new headquarters in Saudi Arabia, though many opted for dual headquarters in both Riyadh and an Emirati city, rather than abandoning UAE entirely. The carrots include massive tax incentives, streamlined regulations, and the promise of preferential access to the kingdom's enormous domestic market and Vision 2030 mega projects worth hundreds of billions. Saudi Arabia has advantages the UAE can never match in pure scale. The kingdom's projected nominal GDP for 2025 is approximately $1.1 trillion compared to UAE's $536 billion. Saudi Arabia has a population of over 35 million compared to UAE's approximately 10 million, providing both larger workforce and larger consumer market. Riyadh is leveraging this scale advantage ruthlessly, offering incentives the smaller UAE simply cannot afford to match. At the same time, UAE introduced federal corporate tax in June 2023 with baseline rate of 9% on profits above certain thresholds, losing its historical image as tax-free paradise exactly when Saudi Arabia is handing out super incentives to firms it wants to lure away. The competition extends into aviation, where Saudi strategy directly targets Dubai's dominance as the region's premier transit hub. Saudi Arabia aims for 330 million passengers annually by 2030 and 30 million transit passengers, up from just 3 million in 2019. This represents existential challenge to Dubai Emirates' East-West transit business model that has made Dubai International and Emirates airline global powerhouses. Riyadh is building new airports, launching new airlines, and investing tens of billions to create viable alternatives. The message is the same. Where once Gulf aviation growth automatically capitalized in Dubai, Riyadh wants future growth flowing through Saudi airports instead. Whether Vision 2030 can actually deliver on these promises remains uncertain. Many projects are behind schedule, costs have ballooned, and questions persist about whether Riyadh can actually create the cosmopolitan, business-friendly environment that made Dubai attractive without fundamental social changes. Many Saudis resist, but the economic competition isn't about who wins decisively. It's about shifting trajectories and redistributing where future growth happens. UAE officials worry less about someone forcibly taking away their current hub status than about the trajectory of region's future growth changing. If Saudi Arabia locks in rules ensuring growth capitalizes primarily inside the kingdom, rather than flowing naturally to Dubai, that changes everything for Emirati long-term planning. The paradox is that both countries might lose from this zero-sum competition, raising costs of regional instability for everyone, while neither achieves decisive advantage. Multiple observers note the rivalry risks becoming self-destructive, with both sides spending enormous sums on projects designed primarily to undermine the other rather than addressing genuine development needs. For the United States, this rivalry creates serious and uncomfortable challenges that Washington has struggled to manage. America has long relied on both Saudi Arabia and UAE as key strategic partners, essential for regional stability, counterterrorism cooperation, balancing Iran, and maintaining energy security. When these two partners work together, U.S. policy had a solid foundation. When they're working against each other and forcing Washington to choose sides, American strategy becomes exponentially more complicated. The dilemma was on full display during MBS's November 2025 visit to Washington. Trump rolled out the red carpet, literally, with arrival ceremony featuring marching bands, flag-carrying horsemen, and military flyover. The president greeted the Saudi crown prince with opulent hospitality, signaling embrace of what Trump sees as new Middle East, driven by financial investments and U.S. partnerships with wealthy Gulf allies. The visit produced significant agreements. Trump designated Saudi Arabia as major non-NATO ally, authorized F-35 fighter jet sales that previous administrations had resisted, signed nuclear cooperation deals, and announced strategic defense partnerships. MBS received warm welcome befitting close ally, and Trump praised anticipated Saudi investments he claimed could reach $600 billion, possibly even $1 trillion. But underneath the pageantry, the visit exposed tensions. According to Axios, reporting citing U.S. officials, Trump and MBS held civil but difficult meeting, where the president pushed hard for Saudi Arabia to join Abraham Accords and normalize relations with Israel. MBS pushed back, telling Trump he could not improve relations with Israel because public sentiment in Saudi Arabia is overwhelmingly anti-Israel following Gaza war. The conversation was reportedly filled with disappointment and irritation, with MBS insisting any potential agreement must include irreversible, credible, time-bound path toward Palestinian statehood. Netanyahu has refused to commit to Palestinian statehood, creating an impasse that American pressure cannot easily resolve. The Israel question reveals another dimension of Saudi-UAE divergence with direct implications for Washington. The UAE normalized relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords in 2020, becoming first Gulf state to officially recognize Israel before establishment of Palestinian state. That decision reflected Abu Dhabi's confidence that it could pursue independent foreign policy, regardless of broader Arab consensus. For UAE leadership, the benefits of Israeli intelligence cooperation, technology partnerships, and strategic coordination against Iran outweighed costs of breaking with Palestinian cause. Saudi Arabia watched this process with deep ambivalence. Before October 7, 2023, normalization with Israel seemed inevitable or even imminent. Then came the Gaza war, and Saudi public opinion hardened dramatically against any relationship with Israel while Palestinian suffering continued. MBS cannot ignore domestic opinion the way MBZ can. As custodian of Islam's two holiest sites in Mecca and Medina, Saudi leadership is more vulnerable to accusations of abandoning fellow Muslims. And recognizing Israel now could trigger unrest the crown prince cannot afford while implementing controversial social reforms. So, two distinct blocs are forming across the region, one led by Saudi Arabia and one led by UAE, in partnership with Israel, and multiple countries have become geopolitical battlegrounds where these blocs compete for influence. Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Syria, Libya, each represents a theater where Saudi Arabia generally backs central governments seeking stability, while UAE and often Israel support separatist or militia forces advancing their own interests. This pattern may define Middle Eastern geopolitics for the next decade, replacing the old Saudi-Iranian rivalry that dominated the region for 40 years with a new inter-Gulf competition that's arguably more complex because it's driven not by ideology, but by economics, influence, and geopolitical ambition between two countries that share similar systems, similar resources, and similar relationships with the West. For Washington, the challenge is managing partnerships with both countries when they're increasingly pursuing contradictory regional agendas. The fact that Saudi Arabia and UAE have both invested so heavily in deepening relations with Trump administration means Washington may become a proxy venue for competitive rivalry if the situation escalates. Both MBS and MBZ have cultivated personal relationships with Trump and his inner circle. Both countries have promised enormous investments in American companies and projects. Both have secured major arms deals and security partnerships. When conflicts arise between them, as they did over Sudan when MBS lobbied Trump against UAE support for RSF, the president must decide whether to accommodate one partner at the expense of alienating the other. There's no good option that keeps everyone happy, and American officials who spent careers building relationships with Gulf states suddenly find themselves navigating rivalries they never anticipated. Multiple analysts note that historical precedent from the Qatar blockade suggests isolation strategies don't work. When Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt tried to isolate Qatar, starting in 2017 through comprehensive boycott and demands for policy changes, Doha refused to make concessions. The blockade ultimately failed, harmed regional cohesion, and was resolved only through Kuwaiti and Omani mediation with American encouragement after more than 3 years. If current Saudi-UAE split follows similar trajectory, it could easily take longer to resolve because this rivalry is freighted with more intense economic and personal competition than the dispute with Qatar ever was. The difference is, Qatar was always the smaller, weaker party being pressured by larger neighbors. In Saudi-UAE rivalry, both sides have enormous resources, global reach, and capacity to sustain competition indefinitely. Some observers believe reconciliation remains possible if both sides climb down and return to cooperation, noting that even now the rivalry operates within certain boundaries. Neither country wants direct military conflict. Economic interdependence remains substantial. Shared interests in countering Iran, managing energy markets, and maintaining stability provide foundation for cooperation when strategic circumstances demand it. The personal relationship between MBS and MBZ, though strained, hasn't completely broken. If circumstances change, particularly if external threats intensify or American pressure becomes overwhelming, tactical accommodations could occur. But structural factors driving competition, especially economic rivalry, and divergent foreign policy approaches, won't disappear with diplomatic nicety. The power struggle between Saudi Arabia and UAE represents a fundamental shift in Middle Eastern geopolitics that Washington has not fully processed. For decades, American strategy in the Gulf rested on alliances with stable monarchies that shared threat perceptions and generally coordinated their responses. That era is ending. What's emerging is a more complex environment where America's Gulf partners compete against each other using the same tools they once used cooperatively: proxy forces, economic leverage, and influence in Washington. Neither Saudi Arabia nor UAE will become enemies of the United States. Both need American security guarantees, military equipment, and diplomatic support, too much to break with Washington. But America can no longer assume that Saudi and Emirati interests align, or that policies benefiting one partner won't antagonize the other. The secret that left Washington speechless isn't that this rivalry exists. Analysts have tracked growing tensions for years. The shock is how quickly cooperation transformed into open confrontation. how willing both sides are to escalate, and how few tools America possesses to manage conflicts between partners who are supposed to be on the same side. When Saudi warplanes bombed Emirati weapons shipments in Yemen, it wasn't just an attack on arms supplies. It was a declaration that the old rules of Gulf cooperation no longer apply, that national interests now override partnership norms, and that both MBS and MBZ are prepared to pursue their visions for regional dominance, regardless of whether that complicates American strategy. The Gulf rivalry that emerged from shadows into open confrontation in late 2025 isn't ending anytime soon, and its implications for regional stability, American influence, and the future of Middle Eastern alliances are only beginning to be understood.